The orphanage on the outskirts of Chicago was a gray, sagging building hidden between rows of neglected houses and overgrown lots. It was the kind of place people hurried past without a second glance, a place filled with forgotten faces and unheard voices. Here lived Peter, a quiet, wiry 10-year-old boy with brown hair that curled around his ears and eyes that had seen too much of the world for his age. Peter had been at the orphanage since he was 5, and to him, it felt like a lifetime. His memories of his early years were faint, a warm touch, a faint lullaby, maybe even a laugh. But they were more like shadows than memories, fading a little more each year. Peter shared his dormitory with 10 other boys, all packed tightly into rows of metal bunk beds with thin, scratchy blankets that did little to keep out the Chicago winter. Nights were the worst. The cold seeped through the walls, biting at their hands and feet, reminding each child of how alone they were in the world. During the day, the staff, often overwhelmed and underpaid, did what they could to keep the children fed and clothed. There was hardly ever a smile or a warm word. Resources were stretched thin, and so was kindness. The children quickly learned that survival here meant hardening themselves to disappointment and learning to expect nothing from anyone. One evening, as Peter sat in the corner of the small recreation room, he watched the other children playing with worn-out toys and old board games with missing pieces. They were laughing, but it felt hollow, as if each child was forcing it, trying to forget where they were and why they were there. A boy named Tom, who was about Peter's age but taller and stronger, walked over and plopped down next to him. "You don't laugh much," Tom said, eyeing Peter curiously. Peter shrugged. "What's there to laugh about?" Tom leaned back against the wall, his expression turning serious. "One day, I'm getting out of here. I'm gonna find a family. Someone who actually wants me. You should do the same." Peter's eyes darkened as he looked down at his hands. "People don't want kids like us, Tom. They want babies, little kids they can mold into their own." Tom sighed, his bravado fading. "Yeah, maybe. But you gotta have hope, right? Otherwise, what's the point?" That word, hope, echoed in Peter's mind long after Tom had left his side. Hope. It seemed like a fragile thing, something that could shatter if held too tightly or neglected too long. And yet, as the lights dimmed and the children were ushered off to bed, Peter found himself holding on to it, however faintly. That night, as he lay in his bunk bed, listening to the soft snores and shifting of the other boys around him, he thought about what it would be like to have a family, to have someone to care for him, to hold him when he was scared, to make him feel like he belonged. In the quiet darkness, he whispered, as if daring the universe to listen, "I want a family. I want to belong." And with that, Peter drifted off to sleep, clutching that small glimmer of hope like a lifeline, unaware that it would soon lead him on a journey that would change his life forever. Despite the bleakness of life in the orphanage, Peter held onto the faintest spark of hope, a dream that someday he would find a family, real family who would welcome him with open arms and make him feel like he belonged. It was a longing that grew stronger with each passing day, intensified by watching families out on the streets of Chicago, parents holding their children's hands or scolding them with loving patience. To Peter, these moments were glimpses into a world he could only dream of. In the orphanage, though, dreaming often felt pointless. Days were repetitive and dull, blending into each other with little difference. Wake up, breakfast, chores, school, back to the orphanage, dinner, and lights out. Every day followed the same rhythm, leaving no room for anything unexpected or hopeful. Yet, Peter couldn't shake that desire, even when his surroundings seemed determined to suffocate it. One afternoon, Peter found himself alone in the small library, a tiny, dusty room with a few shelves of worn-out books. He pulled out an old picture book filled with photos of families at amusement parks, on vacations, and in beautiful, cozy homes. Peter traced his fingers over the images, wondering what it would be like to be part of something like that. As he flipped through the pages, Miss Carroll, one of the few kind-hearted staff members, walked in. "Peter, what are you doing here by yourself?" she asked softly, her voice gentle. He looked up, startled, but then relaxed at the sight of her. Miss Carroll was one of the few people in the orphanage who showed the children a semblance of warmth, even if her job left her exhausted. "Just Looking at pictures, Peter mumbled, feeling slightly embarrassed. Miss Carroll smiled gently. Those families look happy, don't they? Peter nodded, swallowing hard. Do you think I'll ever have a family like that, Miss Carroll? She knelt beside him, her eyes filled with sadness and something Peter couldn't quite read. Maybe regret. I believe there's a family out there for everyone, Peter. Even for you. You just have to keep that hope alive, even when it's hard. Peter frowned, struggling with his next words. Sometimes it feels like it would be easier to just give up, you know? To stop hoping. Miss Carroll's face softened, and she reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Giving up is easy, Peter, but you're stronger than that. I see it in you. Keep that dream close to your heart, no matter how hard things get. You never know what might happen. Peter's heart tightened as he looked into her kind, weary eyes. In the dim light of the library, her words felt like a lifeline, something to cling to in the vast, cold emptiness of his world. Thank you, Miss Carroll, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You're welcome, Peter, she replied softly. Then, with a sigh, she got up and ruffled his hair gently. Now go on and get ready for dinner before you miss it. Peter watched her leave, his heart filled with both gratitude and a profound sadness. Miss Carroll's words stayed with him, lingering in his mind as he made his way to the dining hall. That night, as he lay in his bunk, Peter made a silent vow to himself. No matter how lonely or difficult his life became, he would hold on to that hope, even if it was just a small, flickering flame. He would find a family. One day, somehow, he would belong. But little did he know, that small, flickering flame would soon set off a chain of events that would lead him far beyond the walls of the orphanage and into a world he'd only ever dreamed of. The winter nights in Chicago were brutal, especially for a child with nothing but a thin blanket and layers of worn clothes to keep out the cold. One particularly harsh night, Peter lay awake in his bunk, shivering as the wind howled outside, slipping through cracks in the old orphanage walls. He pulled his knees close to his chest, trying to conserve warmth, but it was no use. The cold seemed to settle in his bones, a reminder of how alone he felt in the world. He tried to push his mind away from the uncomfortable reality, thinking about the dream he held onto, finding a family, experiencing love. But that dream seemed as distant as the stars outside his window. How long could he keep clinging to a hope that might never come true? Days turned into weeks, and each one was marked by the same emptiness. The routines of the orphanage felt suffocating, like he was trapped in an endless loop, with no escape and no future. One night, as Peter lay in bed listening to the muffled snores and shifting of the other boys around him, something inside him snapped. He could no longer bear the thought of staying in that place, waiting for something that might never happen. The idea of escaping was terrifying. Where would he go? How would he survive? But the thought of staying was somehow even worse. He imagined himself growing older in the orphanage, his spirit slowly being crushed by the monotony, the loneliness, the endless waiting. Peter made up his mind. He would leave. It wasn't just a whim. It was a decision that felt like the only choice left to him. He waited until the clock struck midnight, listening intently to the quiet hum of the building. Slowly, he climbed out of bed, careful not to make any noise that might wake the others. He pulled on every piece of clothing he owned, layering his thin sweaters and jackets, trying to prepare himself for the icy streets outside. As he tiptoed down the hall, his heart pounded in his chest, each step feeling like a tiny rebellion against the life he'd been given. The orphanage was silent, every corner shrouded in shadows, and Peter's nerves were taut with fear. When he reached the main door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the cold metal handle. He glanced back down the dark hallway, taking in the only home he had ever known, despite its many flaws. "Goodbye," he whispered to the empty corridor, half expecting to hear someone call out to him, to tell him to stop. But there was nothing, only silence. He took a deep breath, turned the handle, and slipped out into the night. The streets were quiet, and the city lights cast long, eerie shadows across the pavement. Peter's small frame moved quickly, almost darting from shadow to shadow, his breath visible in the freezing air. The buildings around him loomed high, indifferent and unwelcoming, and the vastness of the city felt overwhelming. But he pushed the fear aside and kept moving. He didn't know exactly where he was going, only that he had to keep going, away from the orphanage, away from the emptiness of that life. After a while, fatigue began to weigh on him, and the adrenaline that had fueled his escape started to fade. His legs ached, and his stomach growled from hunger, a reminder that he hadn't eaten since the sparse dinner at the orphanage. He tried to ignore the gnawing pain, pulling his thin jacket tighter around him as he walked through the deserted streets, searching for shelter or some sense of safety. As he wandered, he saw a small park tucked between two large buildings, its benches covered in frost. He approached one, brushing off the ice with his sleeve before curling up on it, hugging himself to preserve warmth. The cold seeped through his clothes, and his whole body trembled, but he told himself he'd find something better tomorrow. He would find food, a warm place to rest. Somehow, he'd survive. Lying there, shivering in the bitter Chicago night, Peter felt a strange mixture of fear and freedom. The future was uncertain and terrifying, but at least he was no longer trapped. For the first time, he felt like he had taken control of his life, like he was moving towards something unknown, something that could finally give his life meaning. The morning sun broke through the gray Chicago sky, casting a faint light over the streets and waking Peter from his restless sleep. He sat up slowly, his joints stiff and aching from the cold, and looked around, momentarily disoriented by his surroundings. The realization of where he was, alone in a vast, indifferent city, settled heavily on his shoulders. His stomach growled again, louder this time, reminding him of his growing need for food. Peter stood and rubbed his hands together, trying to bring some warmth back into his fingers. As he walked through the unfamiliar streets, he kept his head down, hoping to avoid the attention of the morning commuters who were now bustling around him. He watched them hurry past, each wrapped in their own lives, their own concerns, and for a moment, he wished he could blend in, become one of them. As he wandered, he caught sight of a small bakery with warm light spilling from its windows. The scent of fresh bread and pastries drifted through the air, making his stomach clench with hunger. Peter lingered near the door, staring at the trays of golden brown rolls and donuts on display. His mouth watered, and his hand involuntarily reached toward his pocket, only to close around nothing. He didn't have a single penny. He pressed his face to the glass, hoping that somehow, by just looking, he could satisfy the emptiness gnawing inside him. A man behind the counter noticed him, his brow furrowing as he saw the ragged, shivering boy standing outside. Peter's heart raced as he realized he'd been seen, and he quickly turned to walk away, not wanting any trouble. "Hey, kid," the man called after him. Peter froze, considering whether he should run, but hunger kept him rooted in place. He turned slowly, his eyes wide and cautious. The man waved him over, his expression softening as he noticed Peter's hesitation. "Come on in. You look like you could use something warm." Peter shuffled back to the door, his heart pounding, and stepped into the warmth of the bakery. The man pointed to a small table near the back. "Take a seat. I'll bring you something." Peter sat down, his small frame barely filling the chair. He kept his hands folded in his lap, feeling out of place in the cozy bakery. True to his word, the man returned with a steaming cup of hot chocolate and a plate with a warm croissant. Peter's eyes widened as he looked at the food, hardly able to believe it was real. The man set the plate down and gave Peter a gentle smile. "What's your name, kid?" "Peter," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I'm Joe," the man said, sliding into the chair across from him. "So, Peter, you from around here?" Peter shook his head, glancing down at his croissant. "Not really." Joe studied him for a moment, his eyes kind but probing. "Running away, are we?" Peter stiffened, gripping the edge of the table. He didn't want to talk about the orphanage, didn't want to think about it, but Joe's steady gaze seemed to draw the truth out of him. I just needed to leave," Peter admitted, his voice cracking. "I couldn't stay there anymore." Joe nodded slowly, a look of understanding crossing his face. "I get it, kid. Sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. But out here on the streets, it's tough. Real tough." Peter glanced around the bakery, taking in the comforting warmth, the soft murmur of customers chatting, and the smell of fresh bread. It felt like a world apart from the cold, empty streets he had walked through all night. Joe continued, his voice gentle but firm. Look, I don't know what's got you out here alone, but it's dangerous, especially for someone your age. You got anywhere to go? Peter shook his head, swallowing hard as he fought to keep his emotions in check. No, I just thought I'd figure it out, Joe sighed, scratching the back of his neck as he looked at Peter with a mixture of concern and pity. I don't want to pry, but I know some people who might be able to help. Safe places where kids like you can stay, you know? No questions asked. Peter hesitated, torn between his instinct to trust no one and the warm kindness Joe had shown him. He looked down at the croissant, picking at the flaky crust. Part of him wanted to accept Joe's offer, to let someone else take charge for once, but another part of him, the part hardened by years in the orphanage, screamed at him not to trust anyone. I don't know, Peter replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I just need some time. Joe nodded, seeming to understand the hesitation in Peter's eyes. Fair enough, kid, but if you ever change your mind, just come back here. Ask for me. I'll do what I can. Peter offered a small, grateful smile, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. Thanks, Joe. Joe nodded and stood up, giving Peter's shoulder a gentle squeeze. Take care of yourself, Peter. And remember, you're not as alone as you think. As Joe walked back to the counter, Peter took a shaky breath, letting the warmth and kindness of that moment wash over him. He ate the croissant slowly, savoring each bite, knowing it might be a while before he had another meal like this. When he finished, he slipped out of the bakery, glancing back at Joe, who gave him a small nod. Out on the street again, Peter felt a bit stronger, a bit more hopeful. He didn't have a plan yet, but he had a sense of determination growing inside him. The city was big, and it was cold, but maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. As the afternoon shadows stretched across Chicago, Peter walked the city streets, his gaze darting from alleyways to storefronts, trying to stay alert and aware of his surroundings. His brief moment of warmth in Joe's bakery had given him strength, but as the hours wore on, his hunger returned, gnawing at him, and his body grew tired from wandering with no destination. He needed a place to rest, somewhere safe to sleep without the biting cold and hard benches of the night before. Peter considered returning to Joe's bakery but hesitated. He didn't want to rely too heavily on a stranger's kindness, and something in him told him he should keep moving, stay unnoticed. As he turned a corner, his eyes settled on a residential neighborhood he hadn't explored before. It was clearly wealthier than other parts of the city he'd been through. Wide, tree-lined streets with sprawling houses, neatly kept lawns, and iron gates that separated him from a world he couldn't imagine being a part of. Peter paused at the edge of the sidewalk, taking in the imposing houses. These homes had more space in one room than the orphanage had for all its children. He walked slowly along the street, his gaze drifting to a house with large bay windows and a porch swing gently swaying in the breeze. It reminded him of the pictures he had once seen in the orphanage library, images of families gathered in cozy, warm homes. He swallowed hard and, with a quick glance around, moved up the walkway toward the door. His hands shook slightly as he raised his fist to knock, uncertainty gnawing at him. What would he even say? He just needed food, maybe a blanket. The door swung open before he could knock, and Peter took a quick step back, startled. An older man stood there, his expression a mix of surprise and suspicion as he looked down at Peter's worn clothes and tired face. He wore a gray cardigan over a pressed shirt, and his silver hair was neatly combed back. For a moment, they just stared at each other. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Peter cleared his throat, feeling his cheeks burn with embarrassment. I'm sorry to bother you, sir. I was just wondering if you had any food to spare. I haven't eaten much today." The man raised an eyebrow, studying him carefully. He glanced over his shoulder into the house, and then back at Peter. After a moment, he sighed and opened the door wider. "Come inside. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to get you a bite to eat." Peter hesitated, uncertain if he should trust this stranger, but his hunger overpowered his caution. He stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the house envelop him. The entryway led into a spacious living room with polished wood floors and elegant furniture. The air smelled faintly of coffee and something sweet, like cinnamon. "Wait here," the man instructed, motioning toward a chair near the door. "I'll be back in a minute." Peter sat down, his eyes taking in the surroundings, a strange mixture of awe and discomfort settling over him. He felt out of place in this pristine home, a world away from the crowded orphanage or the harsh streets he had roamed. After a few moments, the man returned with a plate of sandwiches and a glass of milk. Peter looked up at him with gratitude, but the man's face held a complex expression, one of curiosity and perhaps a hint of something deeper, something unspoken. "Thank you," Peter said softly, picking up a sandwich. He took a small bite, savoring the taste of fresh bread and cold cuts. It was better than anything he'd had in a long time. The man watched him eat in silence for a few minutes, then cleared his throat. "What's a young boy like you doing out on the streets alone?" Peter hesitated, trying to decide how much to share. He didn't want to reveal too much, didn't want to seem vulnerable, but the man's steady gaze made him feel like hiding the truth was pointless. I just didn't want to stay at the orphanage anymore," he replied, choosing his words carefully. It didn't feel like home. The man's expression softened slightly, a flicker of understanding passing across his face. He nodded slowly, as if he knew exactly what Peter meant. Sometimes, places like that, they can feel more like a prison than a home. Peter looked up in surprise, catching a hint of sadness in the man's eyes. He wondered what kind of past could make someone like him relate to a runaway boy from an orphanage. But he didn't ask. Instead, he took another bite of his sandwich, grateful for the silence between them. After a few minutes, the man spoke again, his tone softer than before. "Do you have a plan, Peter? Somewhere to go?" Peter shook his head, feeling a weight settle in his chest. "No, I was just hoping I'd figure it out as I went along." The man sighed, glancing out the window, his fingers tapping lightly on the arm of the chair. "Wandering the streets, it's no life for a boy your age. You need somewhere safe, somewhere you can sleep without worrying about what might happen." Peter looked down at his plate, his appetite fading. He knew the man was right, but he didn't want to go back to the orphanage, didn't want to return to the loneliness and the walls that had started to feel like a cage. "Thank you for the food, sir," Peter said, setting the plate aside. He stood, unsure of what to do next. The man rose as well, his gaze lingering on Peter for a moment before he spoke. "Listen, if you need anything, a meal, a place to warm up, you can come back here. I don't have much to offer, but I won't turn you away." Peter nodded, a lump forming in his throat as he processed the unexpected kindness. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." As he stepped back out into the chilly evening, Peter felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, uncertainty, and the faintest hint of hope. The man had shown him a glimpse of something he'd longed for but never fully understood. The feeling of being cared for, even if only for a short while. The chill of the evening air nipped at Peter's skin as he walked away from the man's house, each step weighed down by the uncertainty of where he'd go next. The sandwich and warmth from inside had given him a temporary sense of security, but out here again, the streets of Chicago felt as vast and unwelcoming as ever. He stuffed his hands into his pockets, keeping his head low as he navigated through the quieter neighborhoods, hoping he'd find somewhere safe to rest for the night. The streetlights began to flicker on, casting long, eerie shadows along the sidewalk. The city was settling into the calm of evening, with most people behind closed doors, gathering with their families or winding down after a long day. As Peter walked, he caught glimpses of families through brightly lit windows, laughing or sharing a meal, and he felt a pang of loneliness that ran deeper than he'd ever let himself acknowledge. Lost in thought, Peter barely noticed when he veered into a part of the neighborhood he didn't recognize. Here, the buildings grew larger, more elaborate, and further spaced apart. It was clear he was in one of the wealthiest parts of the city. He kept moving, hoping to avoid. "Peter, there's something I need to tell you about myself," he began slowly, his voice strained. "Something I haven't told anyone in a long time." Peter felt his heart thudding in his chest. unsure of where this was going, but sensing the importance of every word. He nodded, silently urging the man to continue. "My name is Edward," the man said, his voice softening as if he were struggling to pull the words together. "Years ago, I lost someone very dear to me. My son." His voice cracked slightly, and he paused, collecting himself. He was just a little boy, barely 5 years old, when he went missing. Peter blinked, the words hitting him like a wave. A missing son? A child who would be around his age now? The pieces started to fit together in a way that made his head spin, but he didn't dare jump to conclusions. He waited, barely breathing, as Edward continued. "For years, I searched for him. I went to the police, put out ads, did everything I could to find him," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. "But as time went on, people began to tell me maybe it was time to give up, that maybe he was gone for good." Peter's hands were trembling now, the pieces of Edward's story tugging at something deep within him. He remembered fleeting memories from his earliest days, voices he could barely remember, faint impressions of warmth and laughter, all of them slipping away as he grew older. Edward's eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear as he looked at Peter. "When I saw you at the door tonight, Peter, I don't know what came over me, but something told me, deep down, that you were him, that you were my son." Peter's mouth went dry, and he struggled to find words. I don't remember much," he admitted, his voice barely audible, "but sometimes I think I remember things from before the orphanage. Just little things." Edward leaned forward, his eyes wide with hope. "Peter, do you remember anything specific? Anything at all?" Peter closed his eyes, searching through the foggy memories of his childhood. He remembered faint sounds, a soft melody he couldn't place, and something else, something that felt almost like a dream. I remember someone singing to me. A lullaby, maybe. And there was this blanket, a blue one with stars on it." Edward's breath caught, and he covered his mouth with his hand, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. That was your mother's lullaby," he whispered, his voice breaking. "And the blanket, it was yours. I still have it." Peter's heart felt like it might burst. The realization of what Edward was saying washed over him, filling him with a mixture of disbelief and hope that was almost too much to bear. Could it be true? Could this man, who had shown him kindness and warmth, really be his father? Edward reached out, his hand trembling as he placed it gently on Peter's shoulder. "Peter, I never thought I'd see you again. I thought I'd lost you forever." Peter looked into Edward's eyes, seeing a reflection of his own emotions, fear, hope, and the desperate need for connection. The weight of all those years of loneliness and longing seemed to lift, replaced by the possibility that he might finally have a place where he belonged. "I don't know how to be a father," Edward said softly, his voice cracking with vulnerability. "But if you'll let me, I want to try. I want to make up for the years we lost. If you'll let me." Tears welled up in Peter's eyes, and he nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He felt Edward's hand tighten on his shoulder, reassuring warmth that filled him with a sense of safety he hadn't felt in years. In that moment, the world outside faded away, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, Peter felt like he was home. They sat together in silence, both lost in the weight of what had just been revealed. Peter could feel the broken pieces of his past slowly coming together, forming something new, something whole. And though the journey ahead was uncertain, he knew he wouldn't be alone. "Thank you," Peter finally managed to whisper, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Edward's eyes filled with tears, and he pulled Peter into a gentle embrace, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll never give up on you, Peter. Not ever again." In the warmth of Edward's arms, Peter felt the emptiness within him begin to fade, replaced by a feeling of belonging, of love that he had never dared to believe was possible. The next morning, Peter awoke in a warm bed, enveloped by thick, soft blankets, a luxury he'd never known. Sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains, casting a gentle glow over the room. He blinked, still feeling the remnants of disbelief from the night before. Had it all really happened? Was he really in the home of the man who, against all odds, was his father? He glanced around the room, taking in the details. A large wooden wardrobe stood in the corner, and a tall bookshelf lined one wall, filled with books that looked like they'd been carefully chosen. A small painting hung above a nightstand, depicting a serene lake surrounded by tall trees. Everything here was warm, welcoming, and yet foreign, like a world he'd never imagined he'd be part of. As he sat up, there was a soft knock at the door. Before he could respond, Edward entered, carrying a tray with breakfast, a plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and a glass of orange juice. Peter's stomach growled at the sight, and he felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Good morning, Peter," Edward greeted, setting the tray down beside him with a gentle smile. "I thought you might be hungry." Peter nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." Edward sat on the edge of the bed, watching Peter with a quiet intensity. The room fell into a comfortable silence as Peter ate, savoring each bite. He could feel Edward's eyes on him, not in a scrutinizing way, but as though he was memorizing every detail. Finally, Edward broke the silence. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said, his voice gentle but serious. "I can't imagine how you must feel, finding out about all of this." Peter looked up, meeting his gaze. It's strange," he admitted. "I always hoped I'd find a family. I never thought it would be like this." Edward nodded, his face softening with understanding. "I didn't either," he replied, a hint of sorrow in his voice. "I spent so many years wondering what happened, wondering if I'd ever see you again. There were days when I lost hope, when I thought I had to let go. But I could never bring myself to truly let go of you." The words hung in the air, filled with a depth of emotion that neither of them had fully expressed. Peter felt something within him stir, a tentative trust beginning to form. He wanted to believe in this new life, in this new bond with Edward. He wanted to believe that he could finally let down the walls he'd built around himself. Edward took a deep breath, seeming to steady himself. "Peter, I know I can't undo the years we lost, and I know I have a lot to prove, but I want you to know, I'm here for you now. I'll do whatever it takes to make up for lost time. I want you to feel safe, to feel at home." Peter looked down at his hands, the familiar fear of disappointment creeping in. He had spent so many years protecting himself from the pain of rejection, of abandonment. But sitting here, with Edward's kind gaze upon him, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'd like that." Edward smiled, relief and warmth radiating from him. "One step at a time," he said softly. "That's all we need to do. We'll take this one day at a time." The rest of the day passed in a blur of small, shared moments. Edward showed Peter around the house, introducing him to each room as though he were welcoming him into his life. The kitchen, filled with the scent of spices and herbs. The library, lined with shelves of books Edward promised to share. The garden, though quiet in the winter chill, hinted at the promise of spring blooms. As they walked, Edward shared stories of the life he had built in Peter's absence, a life that had always felt incomplete. He talked about his work, his interests, and the friends who had supported him through the years. But as they moved through each room, Edward's stories circled back to Peter, to the longing he'd carried and the unwavering hope he'd held onto, even when it felt like an impossible dream. That evening, after a quiet dinner, Peter and Edward sat in the living room by the fireplace. The warmth of the flames cast a soft glow around them, and Peter felt a sense of calm settling over him. "Peter," Edward began, his tone serious but gentle, "I want you to know that I understand if this all feels overwhelming. You've been through a lot, and I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I hope, in time, we can build something real." Peter nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire as he gathered his thoughts. "I'm scared," he admitted finally. "I've always wanted this, but I don't know how to just believe it's real. I don't know how to trust that this won't go away." Edward reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Peter's shoulder. "I can't promise you that everything will be perfect, Peter," he said gently, "but I can promise you that I'm here. No matter how hard it gets, no matter what we have to face, I'll be right here. Peter felt his chest tighten with emotion, the years of loneliness and fear bubbling to the surface. He took a shaky breath, looking up at Edward, and in that moment, he let himself believe, if only a little. Okay, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I'll try. I'll try to trust. Edward smiled, his eyes filled with pride and tenderness. That's all I asked. They sat together in silence, the bond between them growing with each passing moment, each shared word. And as the fire crackled softly beside them, Peter felt the fragile beginnings of something he'd never dared hope for. A real family, a real home. The journey ahead was unknown, but for the first time, he knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. A few days later, as Peter settled into the rhythm of his new life, he found himself thinking more and more about the children he had left behind at the orphanage. Each morning, as he woke up to the smell of a warm breakfast or wandered through the cozy halls of Edward's home, a pang of guilt tugged at him. His friends back at the orphanage were still there, still enduring the same harsh reality he had escaped. He couldn't shake the feeling that he owed them something, that he couldn't just forget about them. One evening, after dinner, Peter mustered the courage to bring it up. Edward was sitting across from him at the dining table, reading over some paperwork, but he looked up as Peter cleared his throat. Edward, Peter began, feeling a bit unsure of how to ask. Edward set the papers down and gave Peter his full attention. Yes, Peter? What's on your mind? Peter shifted in his seat, looking down at his hands. I was thinking about the orphanage, about the kids there. They don't have much, you know? And, well, they're still there and I feel like maybe I should do something. Edward watched him thoughtfully, his expression softening with understanding. You care about them, don't you? Peter nodded. Yeah, they were my friends. Some of them, they don't even have a glimmer of hope. I used to be like that, but I got lucky. I found you. He paused, his voice wavering. I guess I just want to help them somehow. Maybe we could visit? Maybe we could do something for them? Edward's eyes brightened, and a small smile crossed his face. Peter, I think that's a wonderful idea. I'd be honored to go with you. Peter's heart lifted at Edward's words, relief and gratitude washing over him. He had worried that maybe Edward wouldn't understand, that he might not want to revisit such a painful part of Peter's past. But here he was, ready to help in any way he could. The next morning, they set off together. Edward had arranged for his car to be loaded with bags of supplies. Warm blankets, fresh clothes, toys, and books. As they drove, Peter's stomach was a bundle of nerves and excitement. He hadn't been back to the orphanage since the night he'd run away, and he wasn't sure how he would feel stepping through those doors again. When they pulled up outside the gray, worn-down building, Peter felt a chill go through him. The orphanage looked as bleak as ever. Its walls faded, the windows smudged. The memories of cold nights and lonely days came flooding back, and he took a deep breath, feeling Edward's reassuring presence beside him. Edward put a gentle hand on his shoulder. Ready? Peter nodded, and together, they walked to the door, carrying bags filled with supplies. The staff at the orphanage greeted them with surprise, their eyes widening as they saw the bags and recognized Peter. Peter, Miss Carroll, one of the Kinder staff members, looked at him in disbelief. Is that really you? Peter nodded, a shy smile on his face. Hi, Miss Carroll. I wanted to come back and help a little. Miss Carroll's eyes softened, and she pulled him into a gentle hug. We missed you, Peter, she said quietly. The kids will be so happy to see you. They walked down the familiar halls, the echo of their footsteps bringing back memories of the countless days Peter had spent here. The children gathered in the small recreation room looked up in surprise as he entered. Their eyes widened, and a murmur spread through the room as they recognized him. Peter, one of the younger boys shouted, rushing forward with a grin. Soon, Peter was surrounded by the children, their faces lighting up as he handed out toys and blankets, his heart swelling with joy as he saw their excitement. He caught sight of Tom, his old friend, standing a bit apart from the group, watching him with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Hey, Tom, Peter said, approaching him with a smile. Tom nodded, his face serious but with a hint of warmth. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said, trying to sound casual but unable to hide the relief in his voice. "I didn't forget about you guys," Peter replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I wanted to come back. And this is Edward. He's my dad." Tom's eyes widened, and he looked from Peter to Edward, a bit of awe in his gaze. "So you really did find a family?" Peter nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him as he said it out loud. "Yeah, I did. And I wanted to share a bit of it with you all." Edward approached, shaking Tom's hand warmly. "It's good to meet Peter's friends. We're here to help however we can." As the day went on, Peter felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known before. He and Edward spent hours with the children, playing games, reading stories, and sharing laughter that brought life to the old building. Edward even spoke with the staff about ways they could provide ongoing support to improve the orphanage's conditions. Peter watched, filled with gratitude for the man who had become more than just a father. He was someone who understood the importance of kindness, of giving back. As they prepared to leave, Miss Carroll pulled Peter aside, her eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you, Peter, for coming back. You've given these kids hope, something they don't often get." Peter felt a lump in his throat, and he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I wanted to help. I wanted them to know they're not alone." Miss Carroll hugged him tightly. "You've done more than that. You've shown them that dreams do come true." When Peter and Edward finally returned to the car, Peter felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The orphanage would always be a part of his story, but now he was free to move forward, knowing he had left something good behind. As they drove away, Edward glanced at him with pride in his eyes. "I'm so proud of you, Peter. You have a good heart." Peter looked back at him, the words resonating deeply within him. "Thank you, Edward." "Dad," he corrected, a small smile forming on his lips. Edward's face softened, and he reached over, placing a hand on Peter's shoulder. "You're my son, Peter, and I couldn't be prouder." As the city lights blurred past, Peter felt a quiet contentment settle over him. He had come full circle, facing the ghosts of his past, and now he was ready for whatever the future held, because he knew he had a family, a real family, by his side. The weeks following their visit to the orphanage marked a profound change in Peter's life. Every morning, he woke up to a home filled with warmth, with the quiet comfort of knowing he was safe and loved. Edward had become more than just a guardian to him. He was someone who listened, who offered guidance, and who stood by him through each new experience. As winter melted into spring, Peter found himself exploring parts of life he'd never known before. Edward took him to museums, where they marveled at ancient artifacts and colorful paintings. They spent weekends walking through parks, stopping to watch boats drift lazily along the water, and they shared countless hours in Edward's library, each with a book in hand. The city, once cold and vast, became a place of discovery and excitement, a world opening up before Peter's eyes. One afternoon, as they were seated on a park bench overlooking the lake, Edward turned to Peter with a thoughtful expression. "Peter, I've been thinking," he began slowly, his gaze fixed on the water. "About school. I'd like you to have the chance to learn, to build a future for yourself." Peter's face grew serious, and he looked down at his hands. School had always seemed like something out of reach for him, a luxury reserved for children with stable lives and families. But with Edward's steady encouragement, the idea began to feel possible, even exciting. "Do you think I could fit in?" he asked quietly, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Edward placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You'll do just fine. You're stronger than you think, Peter, and I'll be there every step of the way." A few weeks later, Peter found himself standing in front of a small, welcoming school building. Edward had helped him prepare for this new chapter, buying him notebooks, pencils, and even a new backpack. On his first day, Peter's heart raced with a mixture of excitement and nerves. He was grateful to have Edward by his side, walking him to the entrance with a proud smile. "Remember," Edward said, squeezing Peter's shoulder gently, "you've already come so far. Just be yourself, and everything will fall into place." Peter nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The The first few days were challenging. He was adjusting to a new routine, new faces, and the sense of structure that came with school. But as the days turned into weeks, Peter found himself easing into the rhythm of his classes, discovering subjects he enjoyed, and slowly making friends. One afternoon, his teacher, Ms. Harris, noticed him lingering after class, flipping through a book on his desk. She approached with a warm smile. "Peter, I can see you have a real interest in reading. You know, we have a book club that meets every week. I think you'd enjoy it." Peter's eyes lit up, and he nodded shyly. "I'd like that," he replied, feeling a spark of excitement. Joining the book club became a highlight of his week, where he could discuss stories, explore new ideas, and bond with his classmates over their shared love for reading. At home, Peter would excitedly share his experiences with Edward, recounting the day's events over dinner. Edward listened intently, a look of pride and joy in his eyes as he watched Peter blossom into a confident, curious young man. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Edward cleared his throat, his expression turning serious. "Peter," he began softly, "there's something I'd like to ask you. It's something I've been thinking about for a while." Peter looked up, sensing the weight of Edward's words. "What is it?" Edward hesitated for a moment, his gaze warm and steady. "I'd like to make this official, Peter. I want to adopt you. If that's something you'd want too." Peter's breath caught, his eyes widening as he processed the words. A wave of emotion rose within him. Joy, relief, disbelief. He had always dreamed of having a family, but to hear Edward's commitment, his willingness to make Peter his son in every sense of the word, filled him with a profound happiness he could barely contain. "Yes," Peter whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'd like that. I'd like that more than anything." Edward's eyes filled with tears, and he pulled Peter into a warm embrace, holding him close. "You're my son, Peter. You always will be." The adoption process took several months, but with each step, Peter felt more secure, more certain that he was right where he was meant to be. The day they stood before the judge, Peter felt an overwhelming sense of pride and belonging. When the judge officially declared him as Edward's son, Peter's heart swelled with happiness, the years of loneliness finally replaced by the certainty that he was loved. They celebrated the adoption with a small gathering at home, surrounded by Edward's friends, who had come to know Peter and welcomed him as part of their circle. There was laughter, clinking glasses, and toasts to new beginnings. For the first time in his life, Peter felt part of a family, surrounded by people who cared deeply for him. As the guests departed and the house quieted, Edward and Peter sat together, savoring the peace of the evening. "Thank you, Dad," Peter said softly, the word feeling natural, like it had always belonged to Edward. Edward smiled, his arm wrapped around Peter's shoulders. "No, thank you, Peter, for finding me, for letting me be a part of your life." They sat together, basking in the warmth of their bond, content in the knowledge that they had found each other against all odds. The road ahead was filled with unknowns, but they would face it together, bound by the love and resilience that had brought them here. In the quiet of that night, Peter closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his journey fall away. He had a home, a father, a future. For the first time in his life, he felt whole, and he knew, with a certainty that filled him with peace, that he would never be alone again. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving.